Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back through time to a world where politics, lineage, and the occasional whim of a powerful ruler decided the course of human lives before those lives even had a chance to begin. Settle in, maybe grab a blanket, dim the lights, and let's wander quietly into the gilded, labyrinthine chambers of royal harems, the kind of places where luxury and confinement danced hand in hand. And children were born not just into families, but into destinies, pre-written, often in invisible ink. Now, when we imagine a harem, we tend to picture silk drapes, fragrant oils, and women reclining on cushions while a distant ruler, in some cases, a very bored sultan, pays attention to them. And yes, that's accurate enough for bedtime storytelling. But there's another, slightly sadder story lurking behind those drapes. The story of the children, the ones who arrived into lives already burdened with expectation, intrigue, and sometimes barely concealed malice, because, of course, royal children, especially those born in harems, were never just children. They were symbols, pawns, occasional surprises, and sometimes, tragically, mistakes. Their mothers might have been beloved favorites or briefly tolerated concubines. Their fathers might have been tyrants, dreamers, or simply men with too much power and not enough patience. And for these children, the world outside door, even outside their mothers' chambers, was almost irrelevant. Let's drift over to the Ottoman Empire first. The harems of the Ottoman sultans were infamous not just for their size, but for the elaborate rules that governed who could speak, move, or even breathe in a certain room. Children born there were called layazeds, princes in waiting, though in waiting often meant in very close proximity to danger. The sultan might adore them one day, and the court intrigue might ensure their downfall the next. One of the most famous cases is that of Qesaid Mustafa, son of Suleiman the Magnificent. Mustafa, as a child, was reportedly bright and charming, which, built in the twisted ecosystem of a royal court, is often a dangerous combination. You see, a son of a sultan was only as safe as the alliances his mother could muster. Suleiman's consort, Harem Sultan, had ambitions for her own children, which is to say, she wanted them to become sultans eventually, because, naturally, she did. This made Mustafa, whose mother was a different woman entirely, a target of subtle, yet deadly, palace politics. Mustafa's childhood was carefully curated. Tutors, guards, and attendants monitored his every move. He was trained in languages, horse riding, diplomacy, and the not-so-subtle art of surviving a palace where your relatives could quietly plot your demise while smiling. By the time he reached adolescence, he was seen as a potential heir, but so was Harem's son, Selim. And we know how these stories go. Sometimes education and charm can't protect you from ambition. Mustafa's life ended abruptly, a victim of palace intrigue, poisoned by the machinations that began in the quiet corners of a harem decades earlier. Now, not every child met so dramatic an end. Many lived lives of quiet, if constrained, opulence. In Mughal India, children born to concubines might receive all the education of a prince, yet always with the unspoken knowledge that their mother's position was fragile. They were cherished and occasionally feared, but also often entirely dependent on the favor of their father. Young princes might be sent to remote provinces to govern, or to live under the supervision of an older, more politically savvy sibling. The same lavish lifestyle that promised safety also isolated them. A gilded cage cushioned with silk and secrecy. Interestingly, gender played a massive role. Male children were trained to rule lord at least, to appear to have that potential. Female children, on the other hand, were often raised to marry strategically. The daughters of sultans and emperors became currency in dynastic negotiations. Their lives, though sometimes comfortable, were equally constricted. From a young age, they were groomed to project influence not through personal ambition, but through the husbands they would inevitably acquire. Some found freedom and power, quietly influencing their courts. Others were married off, used, and forgotten, their early years in the harem fading into ceremonial obscurity. It's tempting to think that all these children grew up surrounded by opulence and ease. After all, silk sheets and exotic tutors sound like a pleasant start to life. But harem children often experience something else entirely: intense surveillance, endless competition, and the subtle threat of erasure. Allegiances shifted daily, and a child could find themselves adored one morning, dismissed the next, or worse, targeted as part of a larger dynastic chess game. Imagine growing up knowing that someone else's ambition might quietly, lethally, intersect with your breakfast routine. That's a childhood that encourages quiet cunning and, occasionally, paranoia. In fact, the psychological toll of harem life is difficult to overstate. Children learned early that love and protection were conditional. Mothers competed for the sultan's attention. Siblings competed for survival. Advisors watched for signs of weakness or overconfidence. Even playtime, when it existed, was often infused with lessons in hierarchy and expectation. It's not quite the carefree childhood you might imagine from picture books or films. It's more akin to a continuous, whispered negotiation where every gesture could be interpreted, every misstep catalogued, and yet some children flourished. They absorbed lessons in politics, literature, and etiquette, sometimes surpassing expectations. Take, for example, some of the daughters in the Ottoman harem who became influential figures in their own right, quietly directing court decisions and shaping succession without ever leaving their quarters. These children learned the subtle art of influence, a skill that required patience, observation, and the occasional, carefully measured smile. Meanwhile, in European courts, the story was similar, though the settings were different. Concubines were less common, but illegitimate children of monarchs often faced the same precarious balancing act. They might be acknowledged, provided with estates or titles, and yet constantly reminded of their secondary status. Some were given military commands or married off strategically to cement alliances or distract from potential claims to the throne. Many led comfortable lives, but they lived in a shadow. The official heirs enjoyed security, while these children learned early that royal blood could be a blessing and a trap. In China, imperial harems functioned on a similar principle, though the scale was even more elaborate. The children of emperors and concubines were carefully catalogued, their lives tightly regulated. Birth order mattered, maternal rank mattered, and, of course, the emperor's favor was everything. Some boys were quietly eliminated from succession lists, while others were promoted beyond what they might have imagined, all depending on the shifting tides of palace politics. Daughters were trained in art, literature, and subtle diplomacy, often destined to marry princes or generals in distant provinces. Their upbringing was not harsh in the modern sense, but it was rigorous, disciplined, and always politically motivated. And so, drifting back to the general picture, we see that life for children in royal harems, across continents and centuries, shared a pattern, a mixture of luxury and constraint, affection and competition, visibility and peril. They were born into a world where love was conditional, and survival often depended on learning the quiet arts of observation, diplomacy, and self-preservation. Some thrived, some endured, and some, unfortunately, vanished from history. Their lives cut short by intrigue, illness, or the simple misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. In reflecting on these lives, we find a gentle, if sobering, reminder: royalty and wealth do not necessarily confer happiness or safety, especially on children. The silks and jewels may shine, but the corridors behind them often hide anxiety, manipulation, and subtle threats. And perhaps that's the paradox of the Royal Harem, a place designed to display power, pleasure, and beauty, yet also a crucible where children learned very early how fragile life could be. Let's drift a bit further, to one specific, quietly tragic case: the sons of Sultan Ahmed, the first of the Ottoman Empire. Ahmed fathered dozens of children, though only some survived infancy. The harem, bustling and crowded, functioned almost like a small city, with its own hierarchies and systems. His sons, born into relative comfort, were nonetheless subject to the Ottoman practice of fratricide, an unsettlingly direct method to prevent disputes over succession. Ahmed's children often grew up knowing that their very existence could be considered a threat to their siblings. Some survived by luck, some by cleverness, and some did not survive at all. It's a lesson in the intersection of parental love, dynastic ambition, and societal expectation, and it underscores just how precarious royal childhoods could be. And so, as we drift toward the softer edges of this story, we realize that life in the harem was, in many ways, a continuous lesson in patience, observation, and the quiet art of survival. Children born there were rarely free in the way we think of childhood today. They were acutely aware of hierarchy, danger, and favor, and yet some found ways to grow into remarkable figures, rulers, advisors, and cultural influencers shaped, inevitably, by the constraints and teachings of those early years. Asterisk. We can imagine them, perhaps at dusk, in the shadowed corners of a harem, listening to the distant clatter of palace life, learning to smile just enough and to speak just carefully enough. A life of paradox, privilege wrapped in peril, education wrapped in surveillance, and curiosity wrapped in caution. These children, born to luxury and expectation, remind us that even in the most beautiful of places, life can be fragile, complicated, and quietly demanding. And with that, we can slowly let our thoughts wander, picturing the hushed corridors, the soft rustle of silk, and the small, careful footsteps of children navigating lives that were as intricate as the tapestries that lined the walls of their world. Their stories, sometimes tragic, sometimes quietly triumphant, linger in history, not as loud proclamations, but as gentle whispers of lives that existed on the knife's edge between love and danger, comfort and constraint. Asterisk. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time when justice was not particularly swift, fair, or gentle. A world where the gallows loomed over villagers like an overgrown tree, and the executioner's block had a way of appearing in market squares with perfectly casual regularity. So, settle in, dim the lights, perhaps stretch out under a blanket, and let's quietly explore the strange, often absurd ways medieval criminals managed to avoid the ends that awaited them, more, at least delay them long enough to live another day, because, naturally, the Middle Ages were not all grim and bloody. There was, tucked inside the dread and terror, a peculiar creativity at play. People discovered, sometimes by accident, sometimes by sheer audacity, that there were loopholes in the system. If you were clever or charming or in possession of an unusually persuasive tongue, you might just escape what seemed inevitable. And sometimes you didn't just escape. You thrived. Now, when we imagine medieval execution, we tend to picture the familiar, a hangman's noose, a block, a sharp axe, or a merciless stake. And yes, that's accurate enough for the general idea. But the logistics of killing people en masse, or even one at a time, were often awkward, slow, or hilariously mismanaged. Public executions were expensive, ceremonial, and surprisingly bureaucratic. And where there's bureaucracy, there's room for creativity or outright luck. Let's start with the city of London in the late 14th century. The streets were crowded, the law was strict, and the hangings were public spectacles. One man, who had been sentenced for theft, managed to evade execution not through heroic cunning, but through what we might politely call an administrative oversight. The sheriffs responsible for carrying out the sentence forgot to renew the warrant. So, technically, he was no longer under a legal obligation to die. And indeed, he wandered free, perhaps confused, certainly relieved, and likely under a vague sense that he'd cheated fate by merely existing while paperwork lagged behind. Other escapes relied more on social skill than on bureaucratic error. Take, for example, a petty thief in 15th century France. He was caught stealing from a bakery, a crime deserving, in theory, of the local equivalent of a polite decapitation. Yet when presented before the magistrate, he bent into a particularly earnest bow, wept with just enough sincerity, and swore an oath that he would dedicate himself to pious work. The magistrate, perhaps exhausted, distracted, or impressed by the performance, granted clemency. The thief walked away, still in possession of his fingers, and probably returned to similar crimes as soon as the magistrate's attention wandered. And then, there are the more dramatic methods, bordering on audacity or sheer luck. In medieval Europe, it was not unheard of for criminals to exploit the chaotic nature of executions themselves. Executioners were often overworked, underpaid, and occasionally inebriated. A condemned man might be brought to the scaffold, and the axe, sharp though it might be, was operated by a human being prone to mistakes. There are accounts, passed down with some skepticism, of would-be executed men surviving the initial blow, or being dropped onto soft hay in a miscalculation and then being spirited away by sympathetic friends. It's a bit like watching a darkly comedic stage play, except the stakes were very, very high. Another curious loophole comes from the use of sanctuary. In many towns across medieval Europe, churches provided an unusual legal loophole. If you could reach the church doors before the authorities, you could claim sanctuary. And, remarkably, this was often respected. Kings, magistrates, and local lords might grumble, but the principle held. A thief or murderer could dash across a square, burst through the door of a church, and be legally untouchable for a period of time, sometimes up to 40 days. Within that time, arrangements might be made ransom, negotiation, or exile that allowed the criminal to walk free, or at least survive longer than their sentence would suggest. But of course, not all escapes were clever. Some were simply absurd. In one case from Italy, a man condemned for fraud was scheduled for public execution. The town had erected a particularly scenic scaffold over a small river. On the morning of his execution, a sudden flood rose, washing away the scaffold entirely. The crowd panicked. The magistrates fled, and the condemned man disappeared into the mist. Records suggest he may have returned later, smugly, to collect his debts and perhaps to delight in the story of his survival. Then there were escapes that relied on a combination of disguise and audacity. In 16th century Spain, a man condemned for heresy reportedly donned the robes of a priest and mingled with a funeral procession leaving the city. The executioners, bound by both superstition and protocol, did not question the identity of a cleric in such solemn company. He walked away untouched, perhaps praying, or perhaps not, but certainly alive. It's worth noting that luck alone was sometimes sufficient. Medieval executions were not industrialized. Delays, miscommunications, and the occasional drunken official created openings. A condemned person might be transferred from one jail to another, or the executioner might be called away for reasons of diplomacy or illness. In these gaps, survival was possible, often without the individual doing anything particularly clever. Life was, in some ways, less about heroism and more about being in the right or at least not wrong place at the right time. Some escapes became almost ritual. In England, there was the practice of the benefit of clergy. A literate man could recite a passage from the Bible, and by doing so, claim exemption from certain punishments. This led to the curious situation where someone facing execution could quite literally save their own life by reading aloud with sufficient clarity and decorum. The law technically distinguished between clergy and laymen, but a small number of clever criminals discovered that literacy, or at least the ability to sound literate, could be a literal lifesaver. And then, of course, there were the more creative forms of bribery. Executioners were not incorruptible statues of justice. A few coins, a favor, or even a promise of future service could persuade the operator of the gallows to accidentally misplace a noose, slip in a slack knot, or delay proceedings indefinitely. Some criminals spent weeks, even months, negotiating survival in this slow, bureaucratic theater of death. The gallows, as a result, could be a stage for both terror and quiet comedy, depending on the temperament of all involved. Interestingly, geography also mattered. In parts of Germany, for instance, certain local lords granted unusually generous periods before execution, allowing criminals to prepare, appeal, or flee. Towns near borders often experienced more leniency, simply because enforcement was difficult, travel slow, and communication between jurisdictions unreliable. In these spaces, a condemned man could vanish into forests, cross rivers, or hide in sympathetic households. The wilderness, in its quiet, patient way, offered a kind of mercy that the law did not. Sometimes, escapes were accidental. Chains would break, horses would bolt, carts would overturn. One famous case involved a criminal sentenced to hanging who was being transported to the gallows. The cart carrying him hit a rut in the road, and he fell into a ditch. His executioners, embarrassed and annoyed, assumed the gods had intervened. Local custom allowed him to leave, unharmed, though undoubtedly shaken, and perhaps silently thanking whatever deities might have been listening. Yet, the strangest part is how these escapes shaped law enforcement itself. Towns, seeing repeated failures or near escapes, began to innovate. They built sturdier scaffolds, hired more competent executioners, and increased supervision. But human error remained a constant companion. Where there is human error, there is room for chance, charm, or sheer luck to tip the scales in favor of life. By drifting through these tales, we notice a pattern. Medieval criminals survived not merely because they were clever, though that certainly helped. They survived because law, procedure, and execution were themselves messy, slow-moving, and surprisingly negotiable. Bureaucracy, superstition, incompetence, and luck all intersected to create a world in which death, though inevitable in theory, could sometimes be delayed or entirely avoided. Asterisk. And so, as we imagine these men and women on the brink of the final moment, we can picture them not in terror, but in quiet calculation or, in some cases, accidental fortune. A slip of the rope, a well-timed plea, a fortuitous flood. Each instance, a gentle reminder that life in the Middle Ages was, for better or worse, never entirely predictable. Even the smallest details mattered. A token from a sympathetic citizen, a distraction caused by a wandering dog, or simply the executioner's impatience could tip the balance. And while history remembers the many who perished, it quietly records those who survived, sometimes not through brilliance, but through the odd, delicate weave of chance and circumstance. It's comforting, in a way, to think that even in a time dominated by fear, cruelty, and rigid rules, there were openings for human ingenuity, or perhaps just human luck. A reminder, whispered softly across centuries, that survival can take many forms, some heroic, some absurd, some barely understandable at all. And as we drift closer to the end of our story tonight, we can picture the quiet streets of medieval towns, the shadowed gallows, and the occasional, fleeting miracle of a criminal walking away, untouched, and perhaps a little wiser, or at least a little luckier. Asterisk. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back through time, to the dusty roads, muddy camps, and bustling mess halls of ancient armies. Settle in, maybe stretch under a blanket, and let your mind wander to a world of shields, sandals, and rations that were, to be polite, adventurous. We're not talking about heroic charges or grand victories tonight, but something far more comforting, or at least relatable, the daily life of the ordinary soldier. Because, of course, soldiers didn't spend all their time swinging swords or shouting battle cries. They ate, slept, complained, and occasionally discovered that military life was less glamorous than the tales sung by bards. And their routines, though essential for survival, often involved a quiet mix of tedium, ingenuity, and a peculiar kind of endurance that we rarely consider. Let's drift first to the Roman legions, the archetypal professional army of the ancient world. A Roman soldier, or miles, carried more than just a sword. He carried a pack, carefully balanced, filled with tools, a spare cloak, a tent, and, most importantly, food. And what exactly did a Roman soldier eat? Mostly grains, naturally, because nothing fuels an army quite like crushed cereal. Wheat, barley, or sometimes a type of porridge called pulse. It was often cooked into a thick mush, flavored with whatever herbs were handy, or occasionally, if fortune smiled, a bit of cheese or meat. Meat was rare. Not because the Romans disliked it, but because supplying fresh meat to tens of thousands of soldiers marching across Europe and the Middle East was logistically complicated. Instead, they relied on preserved foods, salted pork, dried fish, or occasionally pickled vegetables. One might think this sounds dull, and it was. But the soldiers had ways of surviving. They learned to appreciate what they had, because complaining loudly could, in some cases, be worse than eating the occasional grisly chunk of salted pork. Drink was also a careful consideration. Water was essential, obviously, but rivers could be dirty, wells could be poisoned, or, just plain absent. So Roman soldiers drank posca, a kind of sour diluted vinegar beverage that sounds awful but actually killed germs and provided some calories. Soldiers developed tastes that modern palates might call unique, and yet they marched on, probably muttering under their breaths. But alive, daily life involved more than eating, of course. A Roman soldier's day began with inspection and ended with inspection, with long stretches in between filled with marching, digging, building, or standing guard. Camp life was surprisingly methodical. Soldiers pitched tents in precise layouts, constructed palisades, and dug ditches, defensive works that sometimes took more energy than the battles themselves. They were builders as much as fighters, creating temporary cities wherever they went. And while this sounds tiring, it also provided a rhythm, predictability that must have been strangely comforting in a world of war. Meals were often communal, served in simple metal bowls. Soldiers shared rations, sometimes traded them, and occasionally, if someone had a bit of luck, spiced them up with herbs or vegetables scavenged from the surrounding land. Camaraderie formed around food, because nothing bonds people like grumbling about porridge that's been overcooked or rationed too tightly. The Roman army, despite its reputation for discipline and order, relied on these small, human moments to maintain morale. Moving a bit east, let's consider the armies of ancient China. The soldiers of the Warring States period, and later the Qin dynasty, faced similar routines, though their diets were shaped by geography and culture. Grains remained central: millet, rice, wheatafen, cooked into kanji or steamed cakes. Meat was even scarcer than in Rome, and often reserved for officers or celebratory occasions. Vegetables, when available, were boiled or fermented, and tea, in some regions, served both as a drink and a mild disinfectant. Soldiers in China, much like those in Rome, adapted to the monotony with remarkable resilience. Work was constant. Soldiers trained daily, practiced archery, drilled formations, and maintained weapons and armor. Hygiene was not glamorous. Baths were communal and rare in the field, so soldiers developed a certain tolerance for discomfort and odor. It was all part of the rhythm march: eat, train, guard, sleep, repeat. Repetition became a form of survival, because predictability was a small comfort amid the chaos of war. And let's not forget the boredom. Battles were rare compared to marching and building. Soldiers learned to fill time with small competitions, games, or practical jokes. They carved wooden figurines, practiced swordplay for amusement, or exchanged tales of their homes. In quieter moments, letters might be written or songs hummed, quietly tethering them to the world beyond the camp. Even the smallest pleasures, a warm meal, a clean shirt, a letter from home, were elevated to near luxury in the context of army life. Food itself could become a kind of obsession. Soldiers learned to forage, preserve, and stretch rations. In Rome, they carried hardtack like bread called buchelatum, which lasted weeks. In China, rice cakes could be sun-dried for long marches. Salted fish, beans, and occasionally nuts or dried fruits supplemented the diet. And while it may sound Spartan, these meals were surprisingly nutritious, designed to sustain long marches and intense labor. Soldiers ate for survival, not for pleasure, but in doing so, they developed endurance that modern armies would envy. Sleep was another precious commodity. Soldiers slept in tents or under the open sky, often in tight rows with arms crossed over their chests. Nights were cold, mosquitoes were plentiful, and the sound of distant animals were worse. Enemy scouts was a constant companion. Yet sleep, like food, was rich. Soldiers took shifts, established watches, and learned to nap standing up or sitting against a wall. The human body, when trained in this rhythm, adapted surprisingly well. Let's drift over to the Persian armies now. During the Achaemenid period, soldiers marched across deserts and mountains, faced blistering sun and chilling nights, and relied heavily on dried foods. They carried jerky, dried fruits, and small loaves of barley bread. Water, as always, was a priority. Camp layouts were similarly methodical, with careful attention to defense and supply lines. Persian soldiers, like their Roman and Chinese counterparts, spent most of their days preparing for action rather than engaging in it. Training, maintenance, and ration management consumed the bulk of their time, and yet, even in these rigorous schedules, there was room for small mischief or cleverness. Soldiers swapped rations, sneaked extra servings, or occasionally pranked officers. Discipline was strict, naturally, but humor found its way into even the harshest regiments. Ancient armies were surprisingly human in this regard, balancing rigid hierarchy with moments of quiet, almost private levity. Hygiene and medical care, when considered, were pragmatic rather than luxurious. Wounds were cleaned, but often crudely. Bandages were applied, herbs used for infection control, and infected soldiers were sometimes quarantined. Death was always close, but the day-to-day work of staying alive relied on diligence, not bravery. A soldier who survived the march and the rations often had a better chance of surviving a battle than a more reckless comrade. Asterisk. Interestingly, entertainment also played a role in survival. Soldiers told stories, recited poetry, and occasionally staged amateur performances to pass time. Music was simple: drums, flutes, and occasional stringed instruments, but its rhythmic, repetitive quality provided comfort. Lullabies and slow songs, sung quietly at night, were the original way to soothe anxiety before sleep. Perhaps some of these soldiers, after a long day of building fortifications or marching under the sun, hummed tunes to themselves, imagining distant fields, soft beds, or the quiet of home. Food, work, and rest combined into a rhythm that defined life. Soldiers were neither heroic nor tragic most of the time. They were endurance specialists, quietly persisting under conditions most of us would find unpleasant. Meals of porridge, bread, and the occasional salted meat, long days of drilling, and nights under the stars, all of these formed a pattern, and in that pattern they survived, adapted, and occasionally thrived. By focusing on the ordinary soldier, we see that history is not only about kings and generals. It's also about the quiet resilience of those who marched, built, ate, and slept, day after day, year after year. Their lives, often overlooked, reveal something profound. Survival is as much about routine, resourcefulness, and subtle humor as it is about courage or strategy. And so, as we drift closer to the end of tonight's meditation, we can imagine the quiet rhythm of a Roman camp at dusk. Soldiers sitting cross-legged, spoons scraping against metal bowls, the distant clatter of armor being cleaned, the murmur of conversation in the dying light. Perhaps some are laughing softly at a prank. Perhaps some are quietly hoping the porridge improves tomorrow. The world of the ordinary soldier was never glamorous, but it was vivid, tactile, and intensely human. These men, Roman, Chinese, Persian, or otherwise, were the invisible backbone of empires, sustaining armies not through glory, but through persistence. They remind us, gently, that history is lived in small actions, in the quiet daily rituals, and in the slow accumulation of survival over time. And perhaps that, too, is a comforting thought as we settle under our blankets tonight, that even in worlds so different from ours, people found ways to endure, to laugh quietly, and to carry on. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time when suspicion could ripple through a village like a quiet, cold wind. Settle in, perhaps pull a blanket a little closer, and let your mind wander to the cobblestone streets, thatched cottages, and candlelit courts of early modern Europe. We're not here to frighten, but to explore, gently, what became of women accused of witchcraft after trials. The story is strange, sometimes dark, often quietly tragic, and occasionally almost absurd, because, of course, accusations of witchcraft were rarely about actual magic. They were about fear, social tension, envy, and the convenient need to explain misfortune. A bad harvest, a neighbor's illness, a sudden death, any of these could spark suspicion. And if a woman happened to be outspoken, elderly, poor, or simply unlucky, she might find herself at the center of attention. Not the sort you enjoy. Let's drift first to Germany, where the infamous witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries reached fever pitch. Women accused of witchcraft were brought before courts in small towns and large cities alike. The trials were often elaborate affairs, with interrogations that could last days or weeks. Torture was, naturally, employed, because the truth is more convincing when whispered under the strain of a thumbscrew or suspended rope. But the outcome was rarely uncertain. A confession, real or imagined, was expected, and punishment was inevitable. Yet what happened after the trial? Well, that depended on the verdict, the town, and the whims of local authorities. Those found guilty were often executed, usually by hanging or, in some regions, burning at the stake. And while this is grim to consider, the process was slow, ritualized, and highly bureaucratic. Preparations had to be made, neighbors informed, clergy consulted. Execution, in some strange way, was a social event as much as a punishment. For some women, however, the story did not end in fire or rope. A surprising number survived, either because the trial was interrupted, the sentence was commuted, or sympathetic neighbors intervened. In small towns, families could petition local lords, arguing innocence or promising reform. In some cases, women were imprisoned for years, quietly enduring until political tides shifted or interest waned. Survival was often less about innocence and more about patience and luck. Take, for example, the curious case of Anna Gled in 18th century Switzerland. She was accused of witchcraft under circumstances that now seem almost bureaucratically ridiculous. Yet she was allowed certain small comforts, brief visits, and the occasional letter. Her story ended tragically, but in the meantime, she navigated a system designed to crush her. And in other cases, women found themselves quietly released. Their confessions recanted, their lives resumed under careful observation. Punishments were not always lethal. Some women endured public humiliation, fines, or banishment. Stocks, pillories, and public shaming were preferred in towns where execution was considered politically or economically inconvenient. A woman might be displayed in the town square for hours or days, her name whispered with fear or scorn, while villagers tossed rotten vegetables or heckled her. Afterward, she returned home, her life intact, though forever marked. The psychological toll, of course, was substantial, but survival was survival. Interestingly, The aftermath often involved social negotiation. A woman released from accusation might live quietly, avoid confrontation, and occasionally become an expert in managing suspicion. Others, less fortunate, found themselves under renewed scrutiny as communities feared retribution or repeated misfortune. Reputation became a delicate balancing act. In a society where fear of witches was genuine, a woman's daily behavior was scrutinized long after the trial. Some regions, particularly in England, treated acquitted women with a strange mix of caution and ceremony. Once cleared, they might be escorted home under guard, just in case public opinion had shifted overnight. Acquittal did not erase suspicion. It merely paused it. Women learned to navigate these complexities with subtlety, avoiding loud disputes, tending to neighbors, and cultivating small acts of goodwill. Survival required diplomacy, patience, and often a quiet sense of humor. The stories of women who escaped execution also highlight a quiet resilience. They endured humiliation, interrogation, and social isolation. Yet many returned to domestic life, managed households, and, in some cases, became quietly influential in their communities. Witchcraft trials, while terrifying, inadvertently produced experts in subtle negotiation, social perception, and human behavior. One might almost admire the way some women managed to emerge from such peril, scarred but intact, walking carefully through streets that once threatened their lives. We should also mention the curious practice of trial by ordeal. In some cases, women accused of witchcraft were subjected to tests of endurance, pain, or superstition. Floating in water, holding heated iron, or reciting prayers under duress were methods believed to reveal guilt. Survival of these ordeals sometimes proved innocence or, at least, allowed a woman to claim it. Some women walked away physically unharmed, while others bore burns, bruises, or faint scars. And even these survivors faced social caution. Communities regarded them with a mixture of awe and unease, unsure whether fortune or magic had spared them. In Spain, the Inquisition approached witchcraft differently. Women accused might be interrogated in secret, confined for months, and then quietly released if evidence was insufficient. Here, documentation mattered more than spectacle. A woman could emerge decades later, older, wiser, and perhaps with a renewed understanding of the precariousness of public perception. Life after accusation often involved quiet routines, careful alliances, and the avoidance of gossip. Survival was subtle, almost invisible, and required patience beyond measure. Let's not forget the role of neighbors and community in post-trial life. A woman might be welcomed back into her home, or she might find the village walls lined with wary eyes. Children whispered, husbands frowned, and friends hesitated. Reintegration could take years. Some women cultivated gardens, tended animals, and engaged in charitable work to rebuild trust. Others fled, relocating to distant towns, hoping that new streets carried fewer whispers. The aftermath of accusation was as much social as legal, and often lasted a lifetime in Northern Europe. Some accused women became symbols, quiet legends of endurance. Their survival, accidental or earned, inspired awe and fear. They demonstrated that accusation did not always equal doom, that bureaucratic errors, sympathetic authorities, or simple luck could allow life to continue. And while they rarely spoke openly of their trials, their stories traveled quietly, shaping folklore, superstition, and collective memory. Even within families, outcomes varied. A woman might return to her home only to find relatives cautious, fearful, or resentful. Her husband, children, or siblings sometimes treated her differently, wary of scandal or supernatural retribution. Yet women adapted. They learned to navigate this new reality with care, performing ordinary tasks with extraordinary subtlety, maintaining appearances while quietly asserting their continued presence. Medical and magical remedies played a role too. Women accused of witchcraft might be treated with herbs, charms, or prayers intended to cleanse them of suspicion. Clergy, neighbors, or sympathetic healers sometimes intervened, offering protection, advice, or reassurance. These acts were small, almost ritualistic, but they helped women reclaim some control over lives once threatened by fear and accusation. And so, we drift over to the quieter, almost invisible victories. Some women, having survived, quietly influenced local traditions, guided families, and passed down practical knowledge. They may have been scarred, cautious, and forever marked, but they endured. Their resilience was subtle, unrecorded in grand histories, yet essential in maintaining the social fabric of villages that balanced fear with everyday life. The lessons, gently considered, are remarkable. Accused women learn to navigate human perception, bureaucratic absurdities, and social suspicion. Survival required calm observation, quiet negotiation, and perhaps a sense of humor only understandable to someone who has faced interrogation and endured. Life after trial was not about revenge or celebration, it was about patience, subtlety, and the careful management of everyday existence, even in the darkest corners of history. Then there is a quiet persistence. Women accused of witchcraft remind us that history is not only shaped by kings, generals, or victorious armies. It is also shaped by those who endured, who adapted, and who navigated peril with resilience, intelligence, and discretion. Their lives after trials, often quiet and unnoticed, demonstrate the remarkable human capacity to persist, even under extreme social pressure. As we drift to the edge of sleep tonight, we can picture a woman returning to her cottage after months of trial, sunlight filtering through dusty windows, tending a garden, whispering to chickens, and quietly reclaiming her life. No magic, no drama, just endurance and subtlety. Perhaps she hums softly, remembering the ordeal, yet moving forward. That quiet strength, almost invisible, is what endures in history and what comforts us now as we imagine the past. Softly and slowly, like the gentle flicker of a candle in a quiet room. Asterisk.